On the afternoon of April 22, 1918, a flotilla of British warships set sail from the port of Dover in southeast England. They were bound for the ports of Zeebrugge and Ostend on the German-occupied Belgian coast. Their mission, to sink block ships at the ports to prevent German U-boats from getting out into the North Sea and Atlantic, where they could interfere with Allied shipping routes. At Zeebrugge, the raiders had to storm the heavily fortified seawall, or mole, which protected the harbor. They created a smokescreen to cover their approach from the watchful German gunners. Under intense fire, 3 ships carrying storming parties headed for the mole. They moored alongside the massive structure. The raiders suffered heavy casualties as they struggled to get onto the mole. A submarine packed with explosives rammed the viaduct connecting the mole to the shore to block German reinforcements. 3 block ships made their way to the mouth of the canal along which the U-boats traveled. While taking heavy fire, their crews detonated charges to scuttle the vessels at the canal entrance. Motorboats dashed in and rescued the surviving crew members. The audacious raid on Zeebrugge was the most spectacular event in the Allies' long World War I campaign against the German U-boats. A campaign which became increasingly bitter after the Germans decided to ignore the international rules governing naval warfare. At the beginning of World War I, strict regulations on submarine warfare did not allow for the arbitrary sinking of merchant ships. The submarines had to stop and search them first. The vessels could then be sunk if contraband cargo was found, but the submarine had to assume responsibility for the safety of the ship's crew. Consequently, submarine captains rarely attacked merchant ships. However, Britain's Royal Navy imposed a tight blockade to stop the Germans from importing war materials. And in January 1915, Kaiser Wilhelm retaliated by authorizing his U-boat crews to sink merchant vessels in British waters without warning. The transatlantic liner Lusitania fell victim to the Kaiser's new policy. She set sail from New York on May 1st, with nearly 2,000 passengers and crew on board. 6 days later, a U-boat sunk her off the southern coast of Ireland. Some 1,200 of those on board drowned, including 128 American citizens. There was an outcry in both Britain and the United States, which had not yet entered the war. President Woodrow Wilson warned Berlin that it would be held responsible for any further American deaths. Alarmed that further sinkings might provoke a U.S. declaration of war, the Kaiser ordered a halt to his unrestricted submarine campaign. But the British maintained their naval blockade of Germany. It caused increasing shortages and began to hamper the German war effort. In desperation, the German High Seas Fleet decided to break the blockade by challenging the British Grand Fleet to open battle in the North Sea. The two fleets met off Denmark's Jutland coast on May 31st, 1916. Although the Germans sank more British ships than they lost themselves, they were driven back to port and the blockade remained in place. Caught in a stranglehold, the Germans decided to resume unrestricted submarine warfare in January 1917. Any vessel in the Atlantic was at risk. The German Navy now had many more U-boats in service than in 1915. They were soon ravaging the sea lanes in the Atlantic. Merchant vessels were being sunk at a dramatically increasing rate. The sinkings quickly outstripped the production of new vessels in Britain. The lack of imports brought food stocks in Britain to a dangerously low level. Strict rationing was necessary. Times were grim. But hope came on April 6th, when the United States declared war on Germany. The might of the U.S. Navy could now join the fight against the U-boat. Since the American forces would need to cross the Atlantic, the Allies knew the U-boats had to be stopped. The first objective was to provide protection for the merchant vessels and troopships. The Allies organized their ships into convoys, which were escorted by warships. The move was effective. The rate of sinkings by U-boats dropped. The Allies also began laying a minefield to prevent the U-boats from reaching the Atlantic from the North Sea. But the Great Northern Barrage took many months to complete. At the same time, U-boats operating from the Belgian ports of Zeebrugge and Ostend threatened Allied shipping. The Allies would face many challenges in order to remove this threat. The Royal Navy was well aware that German U-boats were operating from Belgian ports. From these ports, they could use the North Sea to access the Atlantic or the English Channel. Control of the English Channel was crucial to Britain. It was the supply line to maintain British armies fighting on the Western Front in France and Flanders. Therefore, the Royal Navy tried to contain these U-boats in two ways. First, they organized the Dover and Harwich patrols. Based in the southeast port of Dover and the eastern port of Harwich, these naval forces patrolled the North Sea and the entrance to the English Channel. The Dover Barrage was the second line of defense, consisting of a system of nets and minefields. These were laid in the Dover Strait to provide a physical barrier to U-boats trying to get into the channel. However, neither of these efforts proved effective. Indeed, during 1917, more than 250 U-boats managed to get through the Dover Barrage and into the English Channel. The Admiralty knew that the main U-boat base in Belgium was situated at Bruges, 8 miles inland from Ostend and Zeebrugge. It also served as a base for surface warships, especially destroyers. But it was the U-boats which worried the British most. The port of Bruges was connected to the ports of Zeebrugge and Ostend by canals. The U-boats traversed the canals to reach the open sea, usually making the passage at night. The U-boats themselves were housed in concrete shelters, which provided excellent protection against attack. The British did not possess bombs powerful enough to make an air attack on the U-boat base worthwhile. And a way to prevent them from operating. Somehow, they had to stop the U-boats from using the canals linking Bruges with Zeebrugge and Ostend. Admiral Bacon, who was commanding the Dover patrol, proposed blocking the mouths of the canals by destroying the lock gates. He suggested various ways of doing this, including using monitors, which were designed to carry out coastal bombardments. Employing railway guns based in Flanders was another option. Finally, Bacon suggested attacking the lock gates from the air. But none of these methods could guarantee sufficient accuracy to hit such a pinpoint target. Then in the spring of 1917, Sir Douglas Haig, commander of the British armies in France, planned a major offensive in Flanders. If he broke through the German lines, his troops could capture Bruges, and the U-boat threat would be removed. The Admiralty pinned their hopes on Haig. The British began their attack on July 31st, 1917. However, hopes of an early breakthrough were dashed. Heavy rain and artillery fire soon turned the battlefield into a sea of mud. The attack degenerated into a battle of attrition, which lasted until early November. The U-boats at Bruges did not suffer at all. In late 1917, Admiral Roger Keyes was appointed head of the Naval Plans Division at the Admiralty. At age 45, he was the Navy's youngest rear admiral and a typical sailor, eager to strike at the enemy. Keyes was determined to end the U-boat threat in Belgium. He decided that the Dover barrage must be strengthened. He petitioned Admiral Sir Rosalind Weems to give him command of the Dover Patrol. Weems acquiesced, and Keyes assumed his new post on January 1st, 1918. His determination soon infected his subordinates. He strengthened the Dover barrage by using more anti-submarine nets. In addition to that, Keyes laid more minefields in the Dover Strait. He also increased warship patrols. Within weeks, the number of U-boats entering the English Channel declined significantly. But Keyes was certain that the problem could not be overcome unless the U-boats were prevented from leaving Bruges in the first place. He would soon execute his daring plan to block the entrances of the canals from Bruges to Zeebrugge and Ostend. Admiral Roger Keyes knew the only way to stop the German U-boats based at Bruges was to literally block them by sinking vessels at the Zeebrugge and Ostend entrances of the canals, connecting them to Bruges. On February 24, 1918, Keyes submitted his detailed plan to the Admiralty, knowing the challenges ahead. He was aware that both ports were protected by numerous powerful coastal batteries. Keyes also knew that Zeebrugge harbor was protected by a mole, a seawall built to ensure that the waters within the port remained calm and to prevent a buildup of silt. The Germans had guns positioned on the mole and turned it into a fortress. The block ships had to get past these guns to reach the mouth of the canal. This made Zeebrugge a bigger challenge than Ostend, which had no mole. Keyes decided to use smokescreens to mask the approach of his raiding forces from the coastal batteries at both ports. These would be laid by coastal motorboats. He planned to deploy monitors with both forces to engage the coastal batteries with fire. However, there was still the problem of the Zeebrugge mole. Keyes would have to land troops to silence the guns positioned on it. But the mole was protected on the seaward side by a 20-foot-high wall. To get over it, the troops needed to be landed from a shallow draft vessel. Keyes selected the cruiser HMS Vindictive for the task. She was built in 1897, but was strong and easy to handle. In case she fell victim to mines, 2 additional landing vessels would accompany her, the shallow draft ferry boats Iris and Daffodil. All 3 ships were heavily armed. Vindictive was also fitted with an additional upper deck and landing ramps to enable the raiding troops to get over the seawall. "18 landing ramps were installed on the cruiser. Even old mattresses were used to provide extra protection to Vindictive's superstructure. Every possible place was used as a gun platform. The crew brought flamethrowers. Mortars and machine guns increased the cruiser's firepower. Many of these weapons were placed on the new upper deck. Vindictive's bridge was protected by armor. "200 naval volunteers and 700 men of the 4th Battalion Royal Marines made up the Zeebrugge landing force. They underwent rigorous training, but were not told the details of the operation. Keyes had another concern. He was worried that German troops would be sent to reinforce the mole once the attack started. A young submarine officer, Lieutenant Commander Francis Sanford, came up with a solution. He noted that the mole was connected to the shoreline by a viaduct. He proposed to ram this with obsolete submarines filled with explosives. The crews would light delayed action fuses and then be extracted by motorboat. Keyes selected a number of ancient cruisers to be block ships. 3 would be used at Zeebrugge: Intrepid, Iphigenia, and Thetis. Sirius and Brilliant would be sunk at Ostend. Each block ship was filled with 1,500 tons of concrete and equipped with scuttling charges. They were given extra protection and a second set of steering and engine controls. The ships were manned by volunteer skeleton crews. Weather was a critical factor. They needed a moonless night to make it difficult for the German gunners to identify the attacking ships. At low tide, the block ships would be unable to reach the canal entrance. They needed high tide and enough time for the raiding force to escape by dawn. Furthermore, the smokescreen would only work if the wind was blowing in from the sea. Only 5 nights in every lunar month met these conditions. The first possible night was March 12th, but Keyes would not be ready in time. The deadline was set for April 9th. While his men continued their training, the British authorities were focused on the Western Front. On March 21st, 1918, the Germans launched a massive offensive which drove the British back and threatened to cut them off from their French ally. The Allies began to stabilize the situation at the end of the month. Then on April 9th, the Germans struck again, putting additional pressure on the British armies. Keyes intended to mount the operation against Zeebrugge and Ostend that same day, but was delayed by inclement weather. 2 days later, on April 11th, the force set sail under near-perfect conditions. As the ships reached the point where the raiding forces bound for Zeebrugge and Ostend were due to separate, the wind suddenly changed direction. The force of nature rendered useless the smokescreen so crucial to the success of the plan. Keyes had no other option than to order his ships back to base. Concerned by the situation in France, the British Admiralty decided to cancel the operation. Keyes was furious. He argued that a successful raid against the Belgian ports would do wonders for Allied morale during this grim time in France. The Admiralty gave way, and the operation was rescheduled for the night of April 22nd. That afternoon, Keyes boarded the destroyer HMS Warwick. Reminded by his wife that the 23rd was England's National Day, he hoisted the signal, "St. George for England." Captain Alfred Carpenter of HMS Vindictive replied, "May we give the Dragon's tail a damn good twist." The raiders then set sail on their desperate mission. The raiding force bound for Zeebrugge and Ostend set sail on the evening of April 22, 1918, in 3 columns. The cruiser HMS Vindictive, which had the key role to play at Zeebrugge, headed the center column. She towed the 2 ferries, Iris and Daffodil. Admiral Keyes headed the starboard column in the destroyer HMS Warwick. Other destroyers towed the 2 submarines which were to be used against the viaduct connecting the Zeebrugge mole to the shore. Then came the block ships, the monitors, and other destroyers. Coastal motorboats and motor launches darted among the columns. Aircraft patrolled overhead during daylight. Some miles short of the Belgian coast, the raiding force divided into 2, with one part heading for Ostend and the other for Zeebrugge. At approximately 11:30 p.m., as the Zeebrugge force approached its objective, the coastal patrol boats surged forward and released their smoke floats. The wind was blowing from the northwest, wafting the smoke directly towards the coastline. All those taking part in the raid were then issued a tot of rum to keep up their courage. Behind the protective cover of smoke, HMS Vindictive and her 2 companions, Iris and Daffodil, approached the mole. The Germans switched on their searchlights. Their guns opened fire. The destroyers cut loose the submarines C-1 and C-3 as they headed for the steel viaduct. Meanwhile, the monitors HMS Erebus and Terra stood off the coast and continued bombarding the shoreline as they had done for the last week. All was going as planned. Suddenly the wind veered and the smoke screen was dispersed. The German gun crews, alerted by the throbbing of many ships' engines, were now able to see the approaching fleet. Vindictive and her 2 companions were only 250 yards from the mole when they came under fierce fire. Matters were made worse when the guns of a German destroyer tied to the mole added to the din. The boarding parties took cover behind the cruiser's armor, but several of their officers stood exposed on her decks as they checked the defenses. Within 3 minutes, it took the old ship to reach the mole. The two most senior Royal Marines and 2 naval officers were killed or wounded. Worse, Vindictive was not at the correct landing point and was rolling so heavily in the swell that it was impossible to moor her. But with great presence of mind, Lieutenant Harold Campbell nudged the bow of Daffodil against Vindictive's side and pushed her alongside the mole. For the Royal Marines and naval boarding parties, it was not a moment too soon, as they were suffering heavy casualties. It was vital to disembark at once. One officer, seeing a platoon of Royal Marines apparently cowering close to one of the few surviving landing ramps, ordered them ashore, but no one moved. They were all dead, cut down by a single machine gun. The situation was now critical. The boarding parties on Daffodil and Iris were unable to disembark because of the height of the seawall. 2 officers aboard Iris attempted to scale the towering wall with a grapnel and line. One was killed immediately. Lieutenant Commander George Bradford almost made it to the mole before he was shot down. He was awarded a posthumous Victoria Cross, joining his soldier brother who had won the VC in 1916, but also did not survive the war. Despite repeated efforts, those aboard Iris could find no means to get ashore in any significant numbers. The boarding parties from Daffodil now clambered aboard Vindictive to join those struggling to get onto the mole. With shot and shell still lashing the upper decks of the ship, Lieutenant Commander Arthur Harrison led a headlong charge towards the tip of the mole. Every single man in the assault became a casualty. Aboard Vindictive, Sergeant Norman Finch of the Royal Marine Artillery was in the foretop with a section of Marines manning Lewis and pom-pom guns to give cover to the landing parties. As the battle raged, his men fell dead and wounded until only he remained. Undaunted by his wounds, he moved from gun to gun, firing on German positions so that the assault could continue. Another Marine, Captain Edward Bamford, led the last surviving Royal Marines ashore from Vindictive into another desperate action, attacking German fortified positions. But all this courage would be to no avail if the block ships did not succeed in breaching the harbor defenses. Likewise, the critical situation on the mole would only get worse if more Germans arrived as reinforcements. At that very moment, a battalion of German infantry on bicycles approached the mole. The submarine C-3, commanded by Lieutenant Richard Sanford with his crew of 6, appeared in the nick of time and headed towards the steel viaduct in the mole. Without a shot being fired at it, Sanford rammed the submarine into the piles beneath the viaduct. He and his crew escaped in a skiff, but most were wounded by heavy German fire before they were rescued by motor launch. After 12 minutes, the submarine exploded, blowing a 30-yard hole in the viaduct. No reinforcements could reach the mole. Lieutenant Sanford, although badly wounded, survived. The 3 block ships, Iphigenia, Intrepid, and Thetis, now steamed into the harbor. They were targeted by every German gun. Thetis was heavily fired upon. She soon began to fill with water. Commander Ralph Snade, captain of the Thetis, decided to scuttle her early. But both Iphigenia and Intrepid succeeded in entering the canal and were successfully scuttled. Standing by were 2 launches to rescue the crews of the block ships. They were soon loaded to the gunwales and under heavy fire, which inflicted yet more casualties. With klaxons sounding the recall, the launches limped out to sea, where they were rescued by the flagship HMS Warrior. The survivors on the mole limped back to the cruiser Vindictive, carrying their dead and wounded. Iris, which had been unable to land any men on the mole, now pulled away. As she did so, she came under renewed heavy fire from the German guns on the mole. 3 shells hit her in quick succession, causing some 180 casualties. The coastal motorboat set off more smoke canisters, and she was able to limp out to the open sea. 20 minutes later, the battered Vindictive and Daffodil also left the mole and passed into the safety of the smokescreen. The badly battered Daffodil and Iris and the cruiser Vindictive arrived back in port at Dover on the morning of April 23, 1918. After the epic raid, the surviving crew members were greeted as heroes. They had carried out Captain Carpenter's vow to twist the dragon's tail at Zeebrugge. In contrast, the raid against Ostend was a failure, because just as the coastal motorboats began to lay their smokescreen, the wind shifted, exposing the raiding force to the German gunners. Consequently, the 2 block ships were sunk a mile away from the actual entrance to the canal. This setback did not, however, overshadow the achievement at Zeebrugge. Air photographs of the St. George's Day raid on the port revealed that all 3 block ships had been successfully sunk at the mouth of the canal leading to the German U-boat base at Bruges. The buildup of German shipping in Bruges itself seemed to confirm that the canal entrance was totally blocked. The sheer audacity of the Zeebrugge raid caught the imagination of Britain and her allies and lifted morale at a grim time in the war. But the price was high. Of the 1,300 men who took part in the attack, over 600 were killed or wounded. Their bravery was of the highest order. This was recognized by the award of no less than 11 Victoria Crosses, including 3 for the abortive attack on Ostend, and 209 lesser decorations. On no other occasion in British history have so many VCs been awarded in such a short time. Among those honored were Captain Alfred Carpenter, the fearless skipper of HMS Vindictive. Sergeant Norman Finch, who had so gallantly manned the guns in the cruiser's upper deck. Captain Edward Bamford, who led the last storming party onto the mole. And Lieutenant Richard Sanford, who had commanded the submarine C-3. The motor launch crews who rescued their compatriots on the block ships were recognized by the award of the VC to one of their skippers, Lieutenant Percy Dean. King George V held an investiture at Buckingham Palace for the heroes of the raid. He knighted Admiral Roger Keyes, the man who had conceived and led the raid on Zeebrugge. The king also visited the base of those who had taken part in the raid to express his gratitude. Keyes himself remained determined to block the Bruges-Ostend Canal. He pressed the faithful crews of Vindictive into service once more, this time as a block ship with a fresh volunteer crew. He mounted the second attempt against Ostend on the night of May 10th. Sappho, the other block ship, had to drop out after one of her boilers exploded. Commander Godsoe, Vindictive's new captain, managed to sink her in roughly the right place, but was killed in the act. Keyes again and the destroyer Warwick rescued the surviving crew. When it became clear that Vindictive had only blocked 1/3 of the entrance, Keyes wanted to make yet another attempt. But by this time, Allied heavy guns on the Belgian coast were preventing the Germans from using Ostend, and the Admiralty considered another raid unnecessary. British naval intelligence also discovered that the Germans had succeeded in unblocking the canal at Zeebrugge, and were using it again. But the Admiralty decided not to take any further action. The war on the Western Front was by now turning in favor of the Allies. The Germans were forced to switch to the defensive as Allied attacks began to drive them back. The Allies sensed that ultimate victory was near. The Allied naval blockade was also causing increasing suffering and discontent within Germany itself. Opposition grew to continuing the war. Consequently, in early November 1918, the Germans were forced to seek an armistice. They had lost the war. Although the St. George's Day 1918 raid on Zeebrugge was not an unqualified success, it was nevertheless one of the most courageous operations carried out by the Royal Navy in World War I. The spirit of the raiders was handed down to subsequent generations of British sailors and Marines. In 1940, Prime Minister Winston Churchill appointed Sir Roger Keyes Director of Combined Operations. He was responsible for mounting the early commando raids against the coasts of Nazi-occupied Europe. Keyes ensured that they were carried out with the Zeebrugge spirit.